Welcome my channel. Before we dive into this terrifying tale, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe, because uncovering these true historical events takes hours of research, cross-checking, and digging through records most people have forgotten. Tonight's story is one of greed, cruelty, and revenge. How one farmer's decision to enslave a giant Apache man in 1847, Texas set off a chain of violence and terror that no one could have predicted. The story begins in 1847, deep in the heart of Texas, where frontier life was harsh and lawless. The man at the center of this tale was a farmer, well known in his region for his wealth and dominance over the local land, but also for a cruel streak that seemed to have no limit. One day, he captured a man from the Apache tribe, a giant of a man, towering over most settlers, strong enough to pull oxen on his own. The Apache had been traveling through Texas with his band, but a series of events left him isolated, and the farmer saw an opportunity to assert his power. He enslaved the Apache, seeing not a human being, but a tool for labor and a symbol of his own control. The giant Apache was brought to the farmer's land under harsh conditions. Unlike other laborers, his size and strength made him both invaluable and dangerous, and the farmer treated him with extreme suspicion. The local community watched quietly, some horrified, some indifferent. After all, the norms of the frontier often excused cruelty, especially toward Native Americans. But even in these harsh times, there was something about the Apache that commanded attention. He wasn't just physically imposing, there was an air of dignity, intelligence, and awareness in his gaze that unsettled those around him. The farmer didn't see a man, he saw a weapon, and a servant who could either be a fortune or a threat. From the beginning, the Apache resisted in subtle ways. He would slow his work when he could, shift loads in ways that made the farmer suspicious, and watch the farmstead with a quiet, unyielding presence. Every action seemed calculated, as though he were waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim his freedom. The farmer, blind to these warnings, doubled down on his cruelty. He imposed heavier work, constant oversight, and punishments designed to break the man's spirit. He likely believed that a giant like this could be tamed with brute force, but he underestimated the Apache's strength, resilience, and the deep sense of justice that guided him. What made this first chapter so chilling wasn't just the enslavement itself, but the tension it created. Every day, the Apache worked under duress, and every night, he slept with one eye open, listening for opportunities, planning silently. The farmer's own arrogance blinded him to the growing danger he had invited onto his land. Friends and neighbors, who had once laughed at the farmer's boasts, began to whisper warnings. Some noticed the Apache's quiet strength, his refusal to bow completely to the farmer's will. Others told stories of the man's past, a warrior of great skill and courage who had survived countless battles and knew how to survive in the wilderness. These stories only fueled the fear that would later erupt in tragedy. This early period, the capture, the enslavement, the initial resistance, set the stage for everything that followed. The Apache's imprisonment was more than a cruel act. It was a spark. It demonstrated the limits of frontier arrogance, showing that a man cannot simply crush another human being's spirit without consequences. And in this case, the consequences would be both immediate and brutal, forever marking the farmer's life and the history of that region of Texas. By capturing this giant Apache and forcing him into slavery, The farmer unknowingly sealed his own fate. The Apache wasn't just surviving, he was preparing. Every glance, every moment of quiet defiance, every effort to endure, it all built toward a reckoning that would shake the community to its core. What started as an act of cruelty would soon escalate into one of the most violent and shocking stories of revenge Texas had ever seen. All because the farmer misjudged the strength, will, and cunning of the man he thought he could control. Once the Apache was brought to the farm, life under the farmer's control was grueling and relentless. This wasn't just ordinary labor. The man's size and strength meant he was forced to perform work far beyond what anyone else could handle. From dawn to dusk, he toiled in the fields, lifting massive loads of hay, hauling timber, and clearing land that had been untouched for years. The farmer viewed him not as a human being, but as a living machine, a resource to maximize profit and showcase dominance. Every swing of his axe, every heavy lift, was monitored. Any hesitation or perceived defiance was met with threats, beatings, or confinement. The Apache endured it all with a quiet resolve, but it was clear to anyone paying attention that he did not submit willingly. Despite the harsh conditions, the Apache maintained a careful, deliberate composure. He observed everything: the layout of the land, the routines of the farmer, the timing of the guards, and the patterns of other workers. He spoke rarely, choosing words carefully, and when he did, there was a weight to them that made others listen. The other enslaved workers noticed the difference immediately. They whispered about him behind closed doors, marveling at his strength, but fearing his quiet power. He didn't need to intimidate. His presence alone was enough. The farmer, however, remained blind to this subtle tension. He believed brute force could suppress what he didn't understand, convinced that strength alone equaled obedience. As weeks passed, the conditions worsened. The Apache was given inadequate food, long hours of labor, and no reprieve, even in the heat of the Texas sun. Yet he endured, each day building his knowledge of the farm and the people who controlled it. He noticed the farmer's weaknesses, the pride that made him careless, the arrogance that blinded him to danger, and the predictable routines that could be exploited. Even in chains, the Apache moved with a precision that suggested planning. Every forced action was carefully measured, every complaint suppressed, every glance noted. To an outsider, it might have looked like resignation, but in truth, it was patience, the patience of a man preparing for a reckoning. The tension between master and captive grew palpable. The farmer tried to assert authority through cruelty, but it only seemed to harden the Apache's resolve. Each punishment, rather than breaking him, sharpened his focus. The other workers began to notice subtle signs of defiance: the way he would slightly misplace heavy loads, the way he would slow his pace at critical moments, or how he would position himself strategically to observe the farmer's habits. These small acts were invisible to the farmer in the moment, but they laid the foundation for the revenge that was slowly taking shape. Life on the farm wasn't just physically punishing, it was psychologically taxing as well. The Apache endured isolation, scorn, and constant surveillance. Yet he adapted, finding ways to conserve energy while still giving the illusion of compliance. Every strike of the whip, every shouted order, was absorbed and catalogued. The farmer believed he was shaping a tool for his profit, but in reality, he was training a mind capable of meticulous retribution. The Apache's intellect, combined with his physical prowess, made him a force the farmer had underestimated completely. By the time the first signs of rebellion began to appear, it wasn't sudden, it was a culmination of months of observation and quiet endurance. The Apache had learned the rhythm of the farm, when doors were left unlocked, when guards were inattentive, when storms masked movement. He knew the local terrain better than the farmer himself, and he understood the psychology of fear, both in his master and in those around him. Life under the farmer's control, intended to crush him, had instead forged the perfect conditions for the revenge that would soon unfold. The other workers, witnessing the Apache's resilience, began to fear what might happen next. Some felt hope, seeing that he was not broken. Others feared the escalation that might come from his inevitable retaliation. The air on the farm grew tense, every glance, every interaction, charged with unspoken knowledge that something was brewing. The farmer remained oblivious, convinced that the man's compliance was complete. But compliance without spirit is a dangerous illusion, and in the case of this giant Apache, it was merely the calm before a storm. Life under the farmer's control was designed to break him, but it achieved the opposite. Each day of labor, each moment of cruelty, and each opportunity to observe strengthened the Apache's plan. The brutality of the farm became the training ground for a revenge that was precise, terrifying, and unavoidable. In the mind of the enslaved man, patience and preparation were as essential as strength, and the day would come when the farmer would learn, far too late, that he had underestimated the consequences of his cruelty. The tension between the giant Apache and the farmer grew every single day, and it wasn't hard for anyone to feel it in the air. Even without words, the Apache's presence seemed to command attention. His size alone made him impossible to ignore, but there was something else, something deeper, a quiet, simmering strength that suggested he was never truly under control. Every look, every deliberate movement carried a message. He was waiting, watching, and calculating. And those who lived on the farm, the other workers, the guards, even the farmer's own family, began to feel it, even if they couldn't put it into words. At first, the signs of tension were subtle. The Apache would slow his work when the farmer wasn't looking, leaving heavy loads slightly off balance. He would quietly shift logs or adjust plows so that tasks took longer than necessary, never enough to provoke outright punishment, but enough to unsettle the farmer. The farmer, consumed by his own arrogance, laughed at it, calling it laziness or incompetence, never realizing it was a silent protest. But to the other workers, it was unmistakable. The Apache was refusing to be broken, and he was gathering power in every small act of defiance. The community around the farm also began to notice unusual patterns. Neighbors reported that the giant Apache moved with a purpose, even when he appeared idle. Some claimed that while others slept at night, he would wander the fields, testing the strength of the fences, the sturdiness of gates, and the placement of tools. He memorized every detail of the property, from secret paths through the woods to the timing of the farmer's guards. It was as though he was mapping the farm, not as a place of servitude, but as a stage for something much larger. The farmer, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, never suspected how dangerous his captive had become. He continued to impose brutal tasks, forcing the Apache to clear fields, lift enormous timber, and perform work that no other man could have endured. The whippings and punishments were meant to break him, but instead They seemed to fuel a quiet fire within the man. Each strike, each insult, each act of dehumanization was absorbed and remembered. The Apache wasn't just surviving physically, he was preparing mentally, using every day under oppression to strengthen his resolve and plan his eventual retaliation. As months passed, small, unnerving incidents began to occur around the farm, almost imperceptibly at first. Tools would go missing, only to reappear in places that suggested someone had been deliberately sabotaging the work. Animals would act strangely in his presence. Horses balked. Oxen refused orders, and even the farmer's dogs would avoid him. Neighbors whispered about curses and omens, saying that something about the Apache's presence unsettled nature itself. Inside the farm, the workers sensed it too. There was a weight in the air whenever he moved, a sense that control was shifting, even if no one could name it. The Apache's quiet defiance eventually escalated into acts of bold resistance. He would refuse to complete tasks in the order the farmer demanded, subtly undermining the efficiency of the farm. He would strategically delay shipments, misplace livestock, or subtly damage equipment. Always small enough to avoid immediate punishment, but large enough to be noticed over time. Every move was calculated, every action part of a larger strategy. It was a psychological game, one that the farmer could not comprehend, because he only saw strength in brute force. He didn't realize that true power could come from patience, cunning, and a refusal to submit. Even the other enslaved workers began to feel the tension shift. They could see the farmer's growing frustration, the way his face would redden with anger at minor mistakes or delays. And they could see the Apache's unshakable composure, the calmness in his eyes that seemed to pierce the veil of fear the farmer tried to maintain. Whispers started among the workers. Perhaps the man wasn't just biding time. Perhaps he was waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim what had been stolen from him: his freedom, his dignity, his life. By the end of the first year under the farmer's control, the tension had become almost unbearable. The Apache moved with silent authority. The other workers obeyed cautiously, fearing his wrath. And the farmer was increasingly unsettled, though he never admitted it. The stage was set for something inevitable. The Apache had endured every punishment, observed every weakness, and memorized every routine. He had transformed the farm into a trap, one designed not to serve the farmer, but to ensure that the long-awaited revenge would be precise, devastating, and unavoidable. The warning signs were everywhere: the way animals reacted, the subtle sabotage, the quiet defiance. But the farmer remained blind, believing himself untouchable. And in that blindness lay the seeds of his destruction. What started as simple tension, the growing resentment and calculated observation of a man enslaved against his will, would soon explode into violence. The Apache's patience, cunning, and sheer power had been underestimated at every turn, and the consequences of that miscalculation would shock everyone who lived on the farm and beyond. The day of reckoning arrived quietly at first, as though the land itself had been holding its breath. The Apache had been planning, observing, and waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment came when the farm was at its most vulnerable. It was late summer, the sun dipping low, shadows stretching long across the fields. Most of the workers had left to gather crops, and even the farmer's guards were distracted by preparations for a coming storm. The perfect conditions, isolation, distraction, and the underestimation of his captive, aligned and the Apache moved. He started with small, precise actions, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye. A rope snapped here, a tool misplaced there, and the farmer's attention was drawn in every direction except the one that mattered most. The giant man had memorized the layout of the farm over months, and every corner, every hidden path, every weak lock or gate was now an advantage. He had become invisible in plain sight, a force that the farmer could neither predict nor control. And then, in an instant, everything changed. It began with the livestock. The Apache released the cattle from the pens, sending them stampeding through the farmyard. Horses bolted, gates flew open, and chaos erupted. The farmer, stunned, rushed to try and restore order, but his movements were slow and clumsy compared to the Apache's calculated precision. While the animals ran wild, the Apache struck at the structures, cutting ropes, breaking equipment, and setting fire to dry haystacks. Flames leapt into the sky, smoke curling into the evening light, and the cries of animals mixed with shouts from the farmer and his men. What was meant to be control had turned into a nightmare. The farmer attempted to confront the Apache directly, thinking his physical superiority would ensure victory. But here lay his fatal mistake. He had relied on brute force alone, never considering the intelligence and strategy of the man he had enslaved. The Apache met the farmer with a calculated strength, moving with agility and precision despite his massive size. Every strike, every defensive move, was designed to overpower the farmer not just physically, but psychologically. Panic began to take hold. Guards tried to intervene, but in the confusion, their efforts only aided the Apache's strategy. The revenge was not just physical, it was symbolic. The Apache moved deliberately, targeting areas that represented the farmer's power barns, toolsheds, and stockyards. He didn't kill indiscriminately at first. He dismantled, destroyed, and exposed the weaknesses that the farmer had relied upon for so long. Each act of sabotage sent a message: cruelty comes with consequences, and a life taken by force demands retribution. The farm, once a symbol of dominance and control, was now a stage for a reckoning that was inevitable, terrifying, and complete. By the time the sun fully set, the Apache had asserted total control over the farm. Fires burned in the fields, livestock scattered into the surrounding woods, and the farmer, exhausted and terrified, realized the enormity of his mistake. This was no ordinary rebellion. This was precision, patience, and raw strength combined into a single, unstoppable force. The community that had once whispered about his size and presence now understood, too late, that they had underestimated him. Neighbors who had come to investigate described a scene that was almost surreal. Flames licked the sky, smoke twisted into unnatural shapes, and a lone figure, the giant Apache, moved with calm purpose amidst the chaos. One witness later recounted that even in the firelight, his eyes reflected intelligence, fury, and a sense of justice that no words could capture. To see him at that moment was to see the culmination of months of oppression turned into a force of nature, terrifying, unstoppable, and absolute. The farmer himself would not survive the night. He was found later, not just defeated, but broken in spirit, his arrogance and cruelty exposed as his ultimate undoing. The Apache had left his mark on every corner of the property, a testament to the consequences of underestimating a human being's resilience and determination. Some of the surviving workers escaped, carrying the story with them, spreading it across the region. It became a cautionary tale, a warning that cruelty breeds vengeance, and that the smallest acts of resistance can become unstoppable when fueled by intelligence, strength, and the desire for justice. The community remained in shock for weeks. No one dared approach the farm, and those who did reported the eerie silence of a land marked by both fire and memory. The Apache himself vanished into the surrounding wilderness, leaving behind a trail of legend. What had been a farm, once a symbol of dominance, had been transformed into a place of fear, awe, and respect. The Apache's revenge was complete, not just a violent act, but a lesson written into history, showing that strength combined with cunning and patience can overturn even the most oppressive of powers. The brutality of that night became etched into local lore. People spoke of it for generations, not just as a story of revenge, but as a warning that cruelty, no matter how absolute it seems, carries a cost. The Apache had turned captivity into strategy, oppression into opportunity, and fear into a tool. That night in 1847 became a defining moment in Texas history. One remembered not only for the horror it unleashed, but for the undeniable power of one man's unbroken spirit. The aftermath of the Apache's revenge left an impact that would echo across Texas for years, long after the fires were extinguished and the chaos had subsided. The farm, once a thriving symbol of the farmer's power and ambition, was reduced to a smoldering ruin. Buildings were burned, fences torn apart, and livestock scattered into the wild. The neighbors who survived the ordeal didn't just remember the physical destruction, they remembered the sheer terror of what had occurred. For weeks, the surrounding communities spoke in hushed tones about the giant Apache, a man who had turned captivity into an unstoppable force of vengeance. The story spread like wildfire, growing with each retelling, and soon, it wasn't just the farm that bore the mark of fear. The entire region felt it. People avoided the land where the farm had stood, and some claimed it was cursed. Even decades later, locals reported strange occurrences, sudden disappearances of animals, mysterious footprints in the mud, and the occasional glimpse of a towering figure moving silently through the woods. Travelers passing through the area at night would swear they heard the echo of heavy footsteps, or the distant sound of a human voice carried on the wind, warning intruders away. The Apache's presence had transformed the land itself into a reminder of the consequences of cruelty and arrogance. The legend of the Apache grew with every telling. Some described him as a specter, a guardian of justice who would appear whenever someone tried to dominate others unjustly. Others believed he had disappeared into the wilderness to live freely, but with a lingering aura of retribution that would strike anyone foolish enough to repeat the mistakes of the farmer. The story was no longer just about one man's vengeance. It became a moral tale about the dangers of underestimating the strength, intelligence, and resolve of those you oppress. Historians and local storytellers often debated how much of the tale was fact and how much was legend. The farm's ruins were eventually claimed by the wild, swallowed by overgrowth and forest, yet the memory never faded. Families who had lived in the area passed down the story, warning children of the giant Apache who had fought back against injustice. The tale became a symbol of resistance, a demonstration that one person, even enslaved and oppressed, could turn the tide when forced to endure injustice. Over time, the story shaped the behavior and attitudes of the surrounding communities. Farmers and settlers who had once treated their laborers harshly began to speak more cautiously, wary of the idea that cruelty could have unforeseen consequences. Even lawmen and traders traveling through Texas carried the story with them, adding their own interpretations of the events. To them, the Apache wasn't just a man. He had become a force of nature, a warning embodied in human form. The Apache himself vanished into history, but his legend persisted in ways both subtle and terrifying. People claimed that travelers passing near the old farm would sometimes see him standing at the edge of the woods, silent, towering, and watching. Others reported that livestock behaved strangely near the area, as if sensing a presence no one could see. And every so often, when a particularly cruel or greedy person tried to impose their will on others, the story would resurface, whispered warnings that justice could come from the most unexpected and unstoppable sources. In essence, the Apache's revenge left a dual legacy: the physical destruction of the farm and the psychological imprint on the wider community. Fear became intertwined with respect, and even those who never saw him personally felt the weight of his actions. The farm, the farmer, and his legacy were forgotten in time, but the tale of the giant Apache who refused to be broken endured. It became part of the folklore of Texas, a story told around fires, in taverns, and in quiet homes as both a thrilling tale and a solemn reminder. What made this story unforgettable wasn't just the violence, but the lesson it carried. That strength without understanding is nothing, and cruelty can awaken powers in others that cannot be controlled. The Apache had transformed oppression into opportunity, suffering into strategy, and captivity into freedom through sheer will. The land itself seemed to remember, echoing the fear, awe, and respect inspired by one man who refused to be a victim. Even today, when people explore the Texas countryside, some swear they feel a presence in the wind, a subtle reminder of the giant Apache who once walked those lands. His revenge may have been centuries ago, but the story remains vivid, a testament to the enduring power of resilience and the lasting impact one individual can leave on the world. Fear, respect, and legend, all intertwined, marked the Apache's legacy, ensuring that the story of his brutal, precise revenge would never be forgotten.